Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, today it is my honor as Chairman of the Committee on Public Works to sponsor Committee Report number 30 that contains the comprehensive report on the bunkhouses constructed to serve as temporary shelters for the victims of Super Typhoon Yolanda. 7 months ago, the whole country was horrified by the unprecedented monstrous Typhoon Yolanda that claimed almost 7,000 lives and has caused unspeakable destruction that left 90% of the Visayas region ravaged. With more than 200,000 families displaced by Yolanda and more than 500,000 houses wiped out, generous international and local donors, moved by sympathy and compassion, immediately mobilized global assistance to help the estimated 17 million people in 44 provinces and 171 cities and municipalities recover from the tragedy. Like everybody else, I was shocked by the magnitude of the devastation and at some point almost refused to believe that it had happened and could happen again. But life goes on, and we have to face the Herculean challenges ahead. On the 18th of November 2013, after identifying temporary shelters, the government started building bunkhouses in Leyte and Eastern Samar, which were earmarked to serve as temporary shelters for the families rendered homeless by the typhoon. Secretary Panfilo Lacson, Presidential Assistant for Rehabilitation and Recovery, together with architect and urban planner Melino Palafox Jr. and architect Dante Chauco, conducted ocular inspections of several bunkhouses on 16th to 20th January 2014 in 3 different sites, namely Biñan, Eastern Samar, and Palo and Tacloban City, Leyte. The initial assessment showed that the bunkhouses were poorly constructed, which led architect Palafox Jr., who, in his experience in handling post-disaster rehabilitation plans in different countries all over the world, to question the quality of the units, which he even claimed was undersized and substandard based on international criteria. The initial finding was bolstered by reports of an alleged collusion between contractors and, quote, at least one politician, unquote, for possible anomalies in the construction of the bunkhouse. In a letter dated 8 January 2014, Secretary Lacson requested the Criminal Investigative and Detection Group, the CIDG, to, quote, conduct an investigation into the said allegations for the purpose of filing the appropriate charges against the perpetrators, if any. This led to the filing of Senate Resolutions 436 and 439 by Senators Miriam Defensor Santiago and his representation respectively, in order to determine if indeed the bunkhouses were truly substandard and overpriced as alleged. Likewise, to make sure that corrective measures are instituted for the safety and security of the suffering families displaced by the said catastrophe. Your Committee on Public Works, chaired by this representation, conducted a committee hearing on 6 February 2014 and on 13 February 2014, subsequently inspected the subject bunkhouses in Barangay 62, 95, 91 in Tacloban, and Barangay Tacuranga and Pawin in Palo, province of Leyte. During the hearing, the committee was able to unravel some of the important facts in connection to and surrounding the subject of bunkhouses. The bunkhouses plans were drawn up in detail by the Department of Public Works and Highways. The construction materials for these temporary shelters consisted of cocoa lumber, corrugated galvanized iron roofing sheets, and marine and ordinary plywood. The floor area of the bunkhouses with a common toilet and bath totaled 255.28 square meters. With an estimated total cost of 959,345 pesos, the DPWH had asked the contractors to reduce the price of the bunkhouses to 836,018 pesos by netting out the profit margin and overhead expenses. When the construction of the bunkhouses were about to start, it was reported that many local contractors were not available to undertake the civil work since they were tied up with other projects elsewhere. To remedy the situation, the DPWH had to engage the services of contractors from other regions of the country to help in undertaking the construction work. The contractors, however, were hard-pressed to finish the construction of bunkhouses in a short period of just 30 days as mandated or in time for Christmas, because of the fact that the materials needed for specification of the DPWH were not immediately available. To beat the deadline, the contractors went on to start building the bunkhouses using whatever materials were available, even though they were not necessarily in conformity with the specifications prescribed by the Department of Public Works and Highways. This meant that substitutes or alternatives in terms of materials were used instead. As of 30 January 2014, the committee was informed that 54 families had already occupied the bunkhouses. Per the DSWD, the award of each bunkhouse to the family occupants was undertaken through a joint assessment by the Department of Social Welfare and Development with its regional offices and the local government units concerned. Given the aforementioned factual background, your committee has identified 3 major issues that need to be addressed and resolved in the course of the investigation. 1. Whether or not the subject bunkhouses were truly substandard and overpriced, as alleged. 2. Whether or not the design of the bunkhouses was in accordance with international standards and current practices in the building of transitional houses. And 3. Whether or not there existed collusion between the private contractors and, again, quote, at least one politician, close quote, that led to the suspicion that there was an anomaly in the construction of the bunkhouse. After thorough deliberations and careful inspection of the subject bunkhouses, your committee respectfully submits the following findings. The bunkhouses are under specification, as laid down by the Department of Public Works and Highways, thereby making them technically substandard. This is mainly due to the following reasons. The unavailability at that time of construction materials that conform with the standards set or required by the DPWH. The lack of manpower to undertake the construction of the bunkhouses. Due to existing exigencies, the bunkhouses had to be constructed and completed despite the lack of specified materials as required by the DPWH. It is noteworthy to state, however, that despite the deficiencies, the questioned quality of the bunkhouse units are being remedied, and that necessary corrections have been undertaken by the contractors. It is unfortunate that the technical and structural designs set forth by the DPWH were not complied with by the contractors, but it is understandable because the specified construction materials were simply not available at the time that the building of the said shelters had to be completed. Considering the urgent necessity to build these structures, construction proceeded despite such limitations. After all, it was argued, saving lives was the primordial goal that would not be compromised. The bunkhouses were not overpriced, since the contractors had not been paid, even with a single centavo, for their expenses that they incurred in building the structure. Furthermore, price adjustment is a reasonable option as long as the underspecified materials are within the minimum standard of the DPWH. It was clear from the testimony of Secretary Rogelio Singson of DPWH that no payment, much less any down payment, had been made to the bunkhouses contractors, who eventually were even required to correct the noted deficiencies and flaws of the shelter. The use of under-specification materials was not intentional, but because the agreed materials were not readily available at the time when they were constructed, the contractors were required to construct within a period of 30 days to provide temporary shelter to our country. Secretary Singson further explained that they are contemplating to make the necessary adjustments and corresponding deductions to the contract price of the bunkhouses, so long as the questioned materials will meet the minimum requirements of the DPWH. The said move is acceptable and appears reasonable to the committee, considering the attendant circumstances that were present during the construction of the bunkhouses. As regards the issue of non-compliance with international standards for bunkhouses, the committee that found that ideally the guidelines in constructing temporary or transitional houses, among others, for people displaced by natural or man-made calamities, are spelled out in the Sphere Handbook of International Standards. This handbook, which has been used by several countries devastated by great calamities, contains life-saving humanitarian response to people affected and displaced by disaster. Nonetheless, the question raised was, has this been followed in the construction of the bunkhouses in the Visayas region? The conclusion is that the bunkhouses are not in compliance with the international standards in building transitional housing. This is precisely because these were built using the available materials and resources, which were not necessarily according to spec. The prevailing emergency situation then compelled the government to undertake the immediate construction of the bunkhouses despite the lack of quality resources, with the objective of saving lives, which was considered as far more important than complying with the requirements of the law when compliance could not be possible given the constraint of time and resources. Your Committee on Public Works likewise looked into the alleged collusion between the private contractors and at least one politician that allegedly tainted the construction of the bunkhouses with anomalies. During the committee hearing, it was learned that Secretary Lacson had tasked the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group of the Philippine National Police to investigate the matter thoroughly. Police Chief Superintendent Benjamin Magalong of the CIDG testified that Secretary Lacson never mentioned any name of a politician involved in the alleged anomaly. The CIDG, however, assured the committee of its commitment to undertake a more thorough investigation of this specific issue of collusion, and should there exist supporting evidence to prove the alleged anomaly, the issue would be addressed forthwith by pursuing the proper legal action against persons or entities found responsible for any irregularity. Also, in the course of the investigation, it was revealed that the Department of Social Welfare and Development had imposed stringent requirements for families to be qualified for temporary shelter units. The extremely long and arduous bureaucratic processes have prevented family beneficiaries to immediately occupy the bunkhouses despite the emergency situation that they were confronted with. This actually negated the earnest efforts and goals of the national and local governments to ensure and secure the welfare of the family casualties who continue to be exposed to the man-made and natural hazards as they could not immediately transfer to the reserve bunkhouses due to impractical technicalities set forth by the DSWD and which could not be complied with given the loss of documents and other required data and information that had to be submitted to the DSWD. In view of the foregoing, it is respectfully recommended that, number 1, legislative measures should be introduced amending Republic Act number 6541 as amended by Presidential Decree 1096 or the National Building Code and other related laws that will clearly define the minimum design guidelines in building temporary structures, and even permanent evacuation centers to be built in local government units in calamity-prone areas. The proposal to create a Department of Housing and Urban Development introduced in both houses of Congress should be expeditiously approved in order to have a specific government agency that would be focused on the housing or shelter needs of the people. Number 3, legislative measures should likewise be introduced for possible amendment to Republic Act 9184 or the Government Procurement Reform Act that will introduce provisions that prevent unscrupulous contractors, government officials, and employees from taking advantage of the emergency situation when the construction of buildings have to be undertaken as an aftermath of disasters by simply resorting to the use of substandard materials, thereby compromising the structural integrity and livable quality of the structure. Number 4, the DSWD should be flexible enough to simplify the process and procedure of identifying family beneficiaries qualified for comprehensive assistance from the government, giving priority to the provisions of basic and important necessities of the most needy and endangered. Number 5, the CIDG investigation of the reported collusion between private contractors and at least one politician that raised suspicion of alleged irregularities in the construction of the bunkhouses should be vigorously and expeditiously pursued. Should the evidence warrant, appropriate administrative, criminal, and civil charges could be filed against the perpetrators. With the catastrophic horrors of Yolanda, our readiness to respond to such unprecedented scale of destruction has certainly been put to the test. Admittedly, we can honestly claim that much has been learned from this disaster and other less devastating calamities. As we move on beyond the pain from this tragedy, we are now armed with a more resilient spirit and a firm resolve to face whatever future challenges nature confronts us with. Thank you, Mr. President.